My name is Timur Bashirov. Welcome to this webinar series. We'll be speaking today about advanced topics in using the exabyte.io platform. And before we start, I want to speak about a couple of important things. So first of all, the goal of the seminar is to help users that are getting started with the exabyte.io platform to understand how to benefit from it more. This is the second webinar in a monthly series. It's a recurring series, and now we have this third Friday of the month, and that's why we speak about the advanced topics. There is also a Getting Started webinar, which is to explain the basics of the Exabyte platform. Every participant should be a registered exabyte.io user, and every participant will receive this presentation in a PDF format after we're done, and every single highlighted text in this presentation contains a link to documentation. The webinar is recorded and will be made available online. Before we start, you should also understand how to ask questions. There is a chat window in Zoom in the webinar session that we're using. And I've just sent a test message to everybody here. So if you have any questions, please follow up and respond to my message inside the Zoom chat. We will assume that the users are, the webinar attendees are experienced computational material scientists that are familiar with tools like Quantum Espresso, VASP, and similar. We will assume that users understand the basics of Linux and Unix interfaces, and they have an established set of scripts and input files to perform the calculations, and would like to know how to migrate these tools to the Exabyte platform. And we will speak mostly about two options. First of all, there is an option to entirely bypass the web interface and use alternative connection methods to access command line environment, and to reuse existing scripts and input files to run command line jobs. It's a quick way to start, but it's usually error prone and difficult to reuse and share. Then the second option is to adopt the exabyte.io approach to create materials, create workflows, and create a job with materials and workflows. And it will take some time to learn the exabyte approach. However, it will be reusable for multiple materials and easy to share and review. So here is the agenda for today. First of all, we'll speak about the platform infrastructure, alternative connection methods like secure shell, web terminal, remote desktop, and a little bit about the login node to which we will be connecting to, and the file system. And then we will speak more about how we can migrate materials information, the workflows information, and jobs information into the Exabyte platform. All webinar participants, have access to the webinar account in the Exabyte platform. Webinar account is a team account that has advanced features enabled, such as command line access, for example. So during the webinar, to save time, we will be seeing the recorded videos of the functionality, and attendees can follow the presentation on their own time and use the webinar account to perform equivalent actions. Accessing the webinar account can be done through the right-hand sidebar. So first click on your name, like this Team Exabyte on this example. Then select My Accounts inside the sidebar, and then click on Webinar to start using the platform as its team member. Okay, so the first part of this presentation is about the platform infrastructure. We have to understand how the platform architecture looks like for the exabyte.io. And there are multiple pieces, but the most important ones are the blocks that we see here. So in the top left corner, we see the web interface, the web browser that is on the user side, and the web interface, the web application to which the web browser connects. At the bottom, we see the computational clusters that are hosted on multiple cloud providers and contains multiple compute node and storage nodes. In the middle, we see the database, and we also see something that we call the login node, which provides access to remote connection methods, to alternative connection methods to the infrastructure. So if you look at the top part of this diagram in more details, we'll see that there are multiple ways to connect into the login node. And that's essentially what we call the alternative login methods, alternative connection methods. There are things like web terminal, remote desktop, and secure shell. I'm highlighting them with this orange circles in this diagram. And we will be speaking about the alternative connection methods, including those three today. Secure shell connection can be based on any secure shell client like pw.x for Windows or terminal for Mac. There is a web-based command line in terminal as well, equivalent to secure shell connection, but can be started from the web browser. No client is needed here. And then there is a remote desktop connection through a web browser, again, to our login node that contains a CentOS Linux system. So it provides the functionality as any operating system would provide to run graphical tools like Vesta, XKristen, NanoLabo, and such. And there is also the fourth option of using the RESTful API that we will not be focusing on during today's webinar. So let's start with the secure shell. And here is how one can initiate the secure shell with a public-private key pair. So first, one needs to generate the key pair with the public and private keys for secure shell connection. And then secure shell keys can be uploaded inside the account profile interface inside the preferences tab. And here is how it can be done. So we will navigate to the secure shell keys, SSH keys panel. Click on the plus button to add another key, put its title, something that we can easily remember. And then select the key with the .pub extension from the disk. You can see that the key area is populated, and then we save it, and it appears there inside the panel. So whenever the small LED icon turns green from gray, as we saw it in the previous slide, that means the key is active and can be used for authentication. The second option is the web terminal, and here's how we can initiate this connection. First of all, we'll be speaking right now about how to initiate the connection and how to use it to upload and download the data. So the webinar, the web terminal session can be started using the right-hand sidebar as well. So I click on the name in the top here, and then select the terminal, which opens a secure shell connection inside the web browser. Here, what I can do is I can drag and drop files onto my browser window to copy them to the infrastructure node. Here is exactly what I'm doing. So I'll copy the Quantum Espresso SCF input file. And as you can see, it appears there at the end of the list of files. And indeed, it has the right content. And I can change or edit this file. For example, in this case, I'm just changing the name of the file. And then there is a utility that we provided to download these files back to your disk. So if I click, if I type exa download and then pass the name of the file, what happens is that the browser session is automatically downloading these files to disk, this file to disk. So again, what I did is that I uploaded the Quantum Espresso input file, changed its name, and then used the command line utility to download it back into the disk. Okay, here it is, and the list of files on my local system. Now, a couple of important notes here are that we can only upload and download back and from the home folder that user connects into on the login node. That's note number one. And the second note is that to open a copy-paste dialog, sometimes it's handy to copy-paste things from to and from the web terminal. We need to click on Control, Shift, and Command combination, so 3 buttons at once. And here is how we can use a remote desktop session. It's an equivalent connection type. So just like with the web terminal, we open the sidebar and select the remote desktop, which provides us with just that, a desktop session on a remote server. When we want to close it, we click on the cross button here in the top right corner, and we come back to the web interface. Okay. Now, when we are inside the remote desktop session, it's a familiar operating system desktop, just like with any other CentOS system. This is how it looks. And when we click on the applications, we can select one of the pre-installed applications here, which includes things like Vesta, Xcreston, P4WASP, and such. And these are the applications that we can use to analyze the data. These are not the simulation engines themselves. These are the analysis applications. Now, there are also options for using the terminal from within the remote desktop session. And of course, we can navigate the files. So here is the files browser also opened inside the remote desktop session. Now, to understand a little bit more about how to browse the files, we need to understand how the remote login node file system works. And here is a quick diagram that represents the file system structure. At the top here, we can see the login node into which 3 different clusters are mounted in this case. And they're mounted all at their own locations inside the file system. For example, cluster 001 that, let's say, resides on Amazon Web Services, cluster 02 resides on Microsoft Azure. They are all mounted into the login node under their respective disk path. And when there is a user with a certain username, let's call it demo. For example, the user demo will be mounted into cluster 001 home demo from cluster 001, and then cluster 002 home demo from cluster 002. So that's the way to aggregate file systems that come from different clusters, so that people do not have to navigate directly to all these clusters, but can work with a single file system node. Okay. And when we connect through one or more of these alternative connection methods, we connect into this login node. So we do have access to all this file system infrastructure. And that can be demonstrated by starting the file browsing session inside the remote desktop. So here we can see there are links inside the home folder that I'm connected into as a user to cluster 001 and cluster 007. So now we have 2 clusters that are available for users in production. And these are the links to their respective file systems from the login node home folder. Now, once we navigate into a home folder for this specific cluster, in this case, it's cluster 001, we can see its file system directly from login node. And there we have links to organizational accounts where a user is a member. For example, I am a member of exabyte-io account, and I see it here below. And then I can see the data folder where web-based jobs data is organized. This is the data folder. And then there are also links to the Dropbox folder and templates for command line job scripts folder. I will speak about these 2 in a moment. So to understand what the Dropbox folder is, we need to look back at the diagram of the infrastructure. And we can see that the Dropbox, the way that we call it, is connected to every single piece of the infrastructure. It includes the master node, the compute node, the login node, and the web interface itself. And what it is really, it's a limited size cache that is available everywhere. So when we are using the web interface, we can drop in some files into this cache and then access them during the calculation time on the infrastructure. And it's handy for storing some auxiliary data, small, usually less than 1 gigabyte, things like scripts, city potentials, and one important note is that the Jupyter Lab, Jupyter Notebook sessions are also started on this folder. So it's handy to put Jupyter Notebooks into that folder as well. User data folder contains the jobs originated in the web interface, organized into projects and named according to a certain convention. And this convention is demonstrated in this slide. So for example, when we have a user with username Steven and a project that is named default, and a job that's named new job executed on November 11th with a certain ID in the database. The resulting name in the infrastructure will be like this. It will be a concatenation of all these entities. So Steven, default, new job, November 11th, with the ID. So that's a way for us to automatically organize the data for the jobs that originate on the web interface. Of course, when users are using command line interface, there is no way for us to control it, so they're free to put the job directories anywhere they like. But when the jobs originate on the web, we enforce the structure. Okay. Now, why it's important to understand where this data folder resides, it's important to understand it to be able to analyze the data that comes from these calculations. For example, here I have run a calculation for a Fermi surface. And at present, the web interface lacks the capability to visualize it. However, it can be easily done using the remote connection, remote desktop connection. So we can navigate into the directory that belongs to this calculation and use the PWSCF file that was produced by the calculation to visualize the Fermi surface. Okay. So here are a few notes about the remote connection methods. Remote connection is an alternative way to access the exabyte platform. It can be enabled upon request. It is disabled by default, but when you shoot us an email, we can quickly enable it. There are three options. There is an option to connect through a web terminal, remote desktop, that work both in a web browser, and there is a secure shell session as well. The remote sessions are connected to the login node with a separate home folder for each user, and home folders have links to directories for compute clusters. Now, an important note about command line jobs that we'll be covering a little bit later in this webinar is that they must be submitted from within a cluster directory. So the resource management system will only accept the job submissions when the job runtime folder is under one of the compute clusters, not directly inside the login node, outside of the links. And there is a variety of software packages available both via remote desktop and command line modules. Okay, I think I'm mostly done with this first part of the webinar. Are there any questions? Looks like not yet. Okay, so let's continue on and let's figure out how to use the existing information, existing data for quantum espresso calculations and migrate it into the exabyte platform. So here we will start with two input files. And for the case of materials, it really doesn't matter whether it's one or two. For the case of a workflow, in our next part, it will be important. So here are the two files that we'll be dealing with. It's a self-consistent scf.in for calcium, tungsten, oxygen 4. And the second file is for the non-self-consistent calculation for the same system. All right, so this is just a quick view inside my text editor. So our first step would be to prepare the input files and then open a materials designer interface and clone the default material. So here we know that inside the input files for Quantum Espresso, there is material information, the information that characterizes the structure of the material. And I'm highlighting it quickly here. So the first thing that we would do is we would navigate to the list of materials for our account, and then click on the plus button to open the materials designer session. And it usually opens with the default material, so silicon FCC in our case here. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to clone it to create a new material from scratch, and then delete the default one. And I will be working with this new material. It is sort of like a stem cell that will be morphed into the material that I'm importing from the Quantum Espresso input. So here is this new material with the adjusted name. All right, that's step number one. Step number two would be to migrate the information about the crystal lattice parameters from the PWSCF input file. So what I do here is I open the crystal lattice interface, and then I select the crystal lattice as triclinic, because that's what the lattice was in the original file. The iBrav equal to 0 means that the lattice is really not specified. And then I select parameters like cell dimension. Cell dimension parameter in quantum espresso units corresponds to bores. I need to have it in angstroms instead, so I'm converting it. And I'm putting all the two of the three parameters to be equal to 5.3 angstroms, and one of them has to be 5.3 multiplied by 2.15, because that's how it is inside the file, right? If you look at the file again, we'll see that two parameters here are equal to 1, and then there's 2.15 as the c-axis parameter. So all I'm doing here is I'm converting the cell dimension and multiplying it by 2.15 to set the parameters for the lattice. So A and B will be equal to 5.3, and then C will be equal to 11.5. Okay, and then I'm changing the angles here to make them 90 degrees, because that's how it is in the original file. And here I have the lattice converter. So at the end of this process, I have the correct lattice for the material that I'd like to import. That's how it looks like. The next step would be to set the crystal basis parameters using the PWSCF input. And to do that, I'm closing the crystal lattice editor and navigating to the crystal basis editor. So crystal basis is inside the atomic positions. And as we see here, there are already in crystal coordinates. So I'm just copying them over and pasting them into the text area of crystal basis interface. And crystal units are already selected, so I didn't have to do anything else. And as I'm pasting this information, you can see the material is changing in the 3D viewer as well. Okay, I'm just changing the number of repetitions here, making sure that this material indeed is the one that I want to work with. Okay, so we are just copy pasting the atomic positions into the text area of the crystal basis span. The last step for this material to appear in our collection is to save it. So to do that, I navigate to the input-output menu panel. I open it, and then select Save from the panel. So click on Input-Output, click on Save. I can set certain tags for the structure, so I can easily navigate to it in the future inside the database, and I do exactly that. I put a tag from PWSCF, so the metadata for this material, and then I click OK to save it. There is a loader that is shown for a couple of seconds, and then there is operation successful notification that pops up at the bottom. So at this point, I can exit the materials designer interface, and I can see that the calcium tungsten 04 from PWSCF was indeed imported. It has the right tag, and when I navigate into that page, I can see its structure. So if I click on this entry, I will be able to view the material again. Excuse me. So that was the first option. The first option essentially requires us to understand the structural information and translate it, copy it into the materials designer interface. There is another option also, and that is converting the PWSCF input to POSCAR format. So at present, we yet to implement the capability to import the information from PWSCF input directly, the materials information, to parse it and import it. However, we already have this capability for POSCAR format. And when there is a way to convert from PWSCF to POSCAR format, we can use that file directly to upload it into the platform. So here is the website that can do exactly that. cheminfo.org can take input from Quantum Espresso and convert it into a POSCAR BASC format that can further be used to upload this information into the platform from disk. Okay, now once we have uploaded the materials information, the next step is to translate the logic for the workflows, for the simulation workflows that we are running. And to do that, again, we start with the input files, right? These are exactly the same input files that I dealt with before for self-consistent and for non-self-consistent calculation. We only have 2 steps here, and the workflow is relatively simple. However, the procedure will be exactly the same, no matter how complex the workflow is. And the first step in this procedure would be to prepare the input files and open the workflow designer. So I navigate to the list of workflows for my account, for the webinar account in this case, and I click on the plus button to open the workflow designer. And when I do that, the workflow designer opens up with a new empty workflow. An empty workflow here contains a single sub-workflow. That's the panel on the left. And there are no units inside this sub-workflow yet. To understand the terms like workflow, sub-workflow, and unit, I suggest that the viewers visit the Getting Started webinar as well, because that's where we discuss them in more details. Here we assume that this understanding is already present. So the next step is to create or edit an empty workflow to migrate the logic from Quantum Espresso calculation input files. So the first thing that I'm doing here is I'm changing the name of the workflow. It's a new workflow from PWSCF input. And I'm creating the name, adjusting the name for the first sub workflow, SCF and SCF. Okay, the third step is to add a unit to this sub workflow. Excuse me. So when we add the unit to the sub workflow, we have to navigate down to the units panel. And on the units panel, we click on the plus unit button. And we select the unit type to add. For now, we just keep everything as default. It's an execution unit. We append it to the current. And here we go. We have pw_scf unit added to this workflow. Now, as you can see, there are multiple other parameters like the application parameters, the model parameters, and such. And depending on which application we select, the type of execution unit added by default will be different. So for example, if it's a WASP as application, the unit will be added for WASP. Now we have Quantum Espresso, so we have pw_scf unit added. The second step after that is to navigate into this unit and see its content. Step number 4 in the total progression is to edit the content of the unit template. And that's exactly what we do here. We click on the PWSCF and open the panel to edit the properties of this unit. As you can see, we are able to select another flavor, which is a quick way to template the flags for the input for Quantum Espresso. We have multiple templated flavors like SCF, NSCF, bands, relax, and such. And those contain preset input flags. And then we can select the properties to be extracted in this calculation and the monitors, like whether or not you'd like to see the standard output, convergence for electronic and ionic subsystems. And at the bottom here, we can see the actual template. The template for the input files. So the flags that are according to the Quantum Espresso format. So now this template is what we put there by default and doesn't contain the logic that the input file contains. So now what we have to do is to look through these 2 files and migrate the corresponding keys. For example, I'm seeing that there are LK point directory, disk.io, and verbosity that are different in these 2 cases. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm copying the flags and pasting them into this text area. Okay. And I'll have to go through all these flags, all these namespaces. So I'm I'm done with the control namespace, and I'm going to the system namespace and copying the smearing parameters. And then I'm going to electrons namespace and copying its content from the original file. All right. And I'm removing the unnecessary other namespace parts. So what's important to understand here is that there are certain variables like this input restart mode, out there, and such, that we really don't want to touch, even though these variables could be different inside the original calculation, especially for things like job working directory. The platform that we will be submitting these calculations on will automatically decide on the job working directory. As I explained before, there's a data folder, and we form the calculation runtime directory names according to a certain convention that users may not know. And so we keep the job work directory as a variable that is substituted by the infrastructure at the runtime. So we don't want to adjust it here. And then there is template data that we can use to understand what exactly would go into the variables like restart mode. And here, when we click on the template data, we can see the input parameters over here as a dictionary. So restart mode here will be from scratch. And when we click on the preview tab, we see that the template variables are substituted, including the material information too. And again, here we have the default material, which is silicon, to preview the input file. Okay. So the next step is to repeat the same for the other units that are present inside the workflow. The second unit is the non-self-consistent field calculation unit. And I'm repeating the same procedure of adding a unit to the sub workflow. And I'm opening this unit again. And I'm selecting PWSCF as the flavor to quickly populate the necessary fields. Okay, you see the calculation type in this case is NSCF, as expected. And then I'm repeating this procedure of copying the necessary flags into this workflow template. Okay, so exactly the same procedure, making sure that the flags are consistent. And then I visualize the preview to make sure that it looks according to my expectation. Again, here we do not touch the material information. The material information is populated according to the template data. And that's a very fundamental concept that we apply inside the Exabyte platform. We do not touch the material information inside the workflow to be able to apply this workflow to multiple materials. So the quantum espresso files are written with material information inside them. And that makes it difficult to transfer the same logic from one material to another. And we solve this problem by using templates in the Exabyte platform. Okay. So step number 6 here is to save the resulting workflow. The resulting workflow now contains 2 units, and I'd like to adjust its name. SCF and SCF workflow from PWSCF input that contains 2 units and 1 sub workflow, as we can see at the top here. And I'm adding a tag to this workflow to be able to quickly find it in the future. So it comes from PWSCF input. Clicking on the save button at the top, navigating back to my list of workflows, and I can see this workflow available at the top. It contains the SCF and SCF sub workflow. It has the tag from PWSCF input, and its name is SCF and SCF workflow from PWSCF input. Okay, I can open it again, make sure that everything is according to what I expect it to be. And here it is ready for me to use. Another option. So here in the first example, we have created the workflow from scratch using the workflow designer. Another option is to copy a similar workflow from bank and adjust its parameters. It is quite likely that the workflows that you are dealing with as a user have already been created in the platform and are available inside the workflows bank. The workflows bank is the collection of unique workflows, unique entities ever created inside the exabyte platform. So instead of starting from scratch, we can navigate to the workflows bank and find a workflow that somebody else has created that executes exactly the same logic that our input files contain. So this is exactly what I'm demonstrating here. We can navigate to the bank page by selecting bank in the left-hand sidebar, then clicking workflows. And then we can search for band structure inside the workflows input panel. And then we can select the workflow to copy it into our private collection. Every account has its own private collection of workflows, materials, and jobs. And bank workflows really meant for people to share this information as one single knowledge bank inside the platform. So here is when I copy it, the workflow, here it is at the top of my private collection. Okay, so that's the second option. Now I can navigate into this workflow and adjust its parameters just like I did with the empty workflow before. Okay, let's see if we have any questions at this point. Is it at least clear how to ask questions? Can I get a ping from one of the attendees? Okay. All right, so let's proceed forward as there are no questions yet. And let's understand how we can use the materials and workflow information to create and run simulation jobs. And again, there are two options really. One option is to entirely bypass the web interface and use alternative connection options that we looked into at the very beginning of this presentation. And it has its own pros and cons. Pros are that it's quick to start with, but it's usually error prone and difficult to reuse and share. And the second option is to adopt the exabyte platform approach and use the entities like material that we just created and workflow. And then we can create a job with this material and workflow. It takes some time to learn this approach, and that's the negative factor. The positive factor is that this approach can be reused for multiple materials, and it's easy to share and review this information. For brevity, we'll be using CLI and UI for these two different options in this section. So first of all, we need to understand how to run a command line CLI job. We need to come back to the folder structure of the cluster master node. So cluster 001, home folder for a user, looks like this. And it contains job script templates, which contain directories with pre-arranged files for quick command line calculation templates. So we can either use that directory to copy VAS per quantum espresso calculations and then adjust the input files there, or we can create the batch script from scratch according to the specifications of the resource management system to submit and run this calculation job. And that's what we are going to describe in this presentation. So here I have exactly the same input file set. Again, SCF and NSCF files, just like we had before. And what I need to do is to open the documentation tutorial to understand the specifications for the input file, for the job script input file. Here is the tutorial. I'm running jobs with command line interface. And I will be following this exact tutorial the right now, except for the information from the Espresso input files. So step number 2, I open the terminal session from the web. Here is my home directory on the login node. And I navigate into cluster 001. So I change directory to cluster 001 here at the bottom. And I create a directory. Oh, before I do that, I also navigate into the seminar account to be able to use its disk space. So every account has its disk space, and seminar has a certain allocated disk space for it. So I navigate into cluster 001 seminar subdirectory, and here I create the runtime directory for the command line run. And I call it calcium, tungsten, oxygen 4, CAWO4. Navigate into that directory, copy the input files from my disk, just drag and drop them into the browser, and move these files from my home folder to this runtime folder. As we noted before, the files, when we drag and drop them into the web terminal session, are copied into the login node home folder, so we have to move them into the runtime folder to use them, right? And then I remove this SCF editor file, which I don't need anymore. Okay, so at the end of the step, I have a runtime directory prepared in the command line session that contains exactly the same input files that I had on the disk. The next step is to set the pseudopotentials. Quantum Espresso is a pseudopotential density functional theory engine that needs the pseudopotential files to be present for it to run. And so what we would do is we would edit the corresponding fields inside the input file on the remote machine directly using a command line session, and put the information about the pseudopotentials available by default. So we have a default list of pseudopotentials available, and they are organized inside /export/share/pseudo by the element. So silicon is going to be a /export/share/pseudo/si, and then the naming convention also includes the type of functional and where these pseudopotentials come from. The default set that we recommend for Quantum Espresso is the GBRV set, and here is the full path for it in this case. So when we go forward with this, what we can do is we can copy one of these paths, and here I'm opening the left sidebar interface inside the web terminal session. It's Control-Shift-Command to open this interface. And then I have to copy this string into this clipboard, and then use the middle mouse button to copy it back into the webinar, into the web terminal. So I'm opening this left-hand sidebar interface for the terminal, pasting the information that I just selected for the pseudopotential path, and then using the middle mouse button to paste it into the web terminal. Okay, so this is a little quirk that we have to deal with when using the web terminal session. With the SSH terminal, we don't have to do that, of course. Okay, so now I'm copying the corresponding pseudopotential file. So for calcium, I found one. For tungsten, I found the second pseudopotential. And then I found the last one for oxygen and copied it to the local directory. So now I have the SCF and SCF input files and the pseudopotential files too. Okay. I do not have to copy those files. I can just link them, or I can indicate the exact paths. But for the purpose of this tutorial, we're just copying everything under the job runtime directory. And the last step is to edit the input file to put the correct information about the pseudopotentials. So to spare the viewers some time, what happens is that I'm using the command line editor to edit atomic species information and put the correct pseudopotential file names there. Okay, so at the end, calcium, oxygen, and tungsten have to have the right pseudopotential file information inside the input file. Okay, so at this step, we have all the required files except for the job script. So the next step would be to edit the job script, the batch job script file, to introduce the logic for this workflow and accounting parameters. And that's exactly what we do. So batch script, a template for it, is also present inside the tutorial. So we copy it to clipboard. Then we navigate back to the web terminal, use the copy-paste dialog again. So open job PBS file, an empty file in this case, and use the clipboard session to paste the content of this file. Okay, again, it's Command-Control-Shift to open the clipboard session. Just Command-V to paste the content from your local disk, and then middle mouse button to paste it into the Veeam session on the web terminal. Okay, so here we only have a single calculation unit, right? The MPI run, pw.x, which uses the SCF in and SCF out. And I'm using a quick feature here that is handy to see the output of the SCF.out. So if you can pipe it into T, the command line application, we will be able to both store it inside the file and see its output inside the command line terminal. Okay, so I'm just renaming the input files quickly here, copying that line to run SCF and NSCF, the two steps that I have inside the workflow. So all I'm doing here again is I'm adjusting the batch job script to copy the logic that I had inside the workflow. So the workflow here is just these two lines. Run pw.x with SCF input and run pw.x with nscf.in file. The next step is to adjust the accounting parameters, and this includes things like my email address, the name of this job, and most importantly, when we are running the calculations, we need to put the project name, which will tell the resource management system which project to charge this calculation for. All of that is accounted for automatically when we create the jobs on the web interface. Here we have to set it manually using the JobScript file. And the accounting name is available at the project job level inside the web interface. So if we navigate into one of the projects, we can see its name as an accounting name. So it's seminar-default in this case. So I'm copying that and introducing that into the job script. So at this point, I have the job script ready. I have the input files ready. I have the pseudopotential files ready as well. So everything is ready for me to run the calculation. Now, the next step is to use the resource management directive like qsub to submit the calculation. When we do that, we pass out the PBS script, the job.pbs file that we just edited, and it responds back with the identifier, the JID, the job ID for this job. And we can use qstat to see that it in fact was submitted. So right now it's submitted, it's in the queued state. It requires one processor for 2 hours. And then we can watch how it goes from queued to running state. It happens very quickly because we use the debug queue. Just within a few seconds, it starts running. And then we can list the directory again to make sure that there is the output files, like scf.out, as well as wave function files and things like temporary directory that Quantum Espresso creates. Now, in this particular case, initially I have used the input file that contains 4 by 4 by 2 key point sampling. So on a single node for this relatively large material cell, it would take a long time. So I intentionally come back and change the key points to 1 by 1 by 1 to make the calculation run faster. And then I see that my job is already running. And what I do is that I delete that job that I submitted first. I have to use the full job identifier like this. So qdel with the full job identifier to delete it. And then I submit the second job that only has a single key point. And that progresses relatively quickly. So within a few seconds, I see that both the SCF and NSCF output files are present. And we can see that the calculations are finished. So if I tail star.out, we see that the NSCF and SCF are all complete. And the job is complete as well. Okay, so that's how we get to the completion of a command line job. And then the sixth step in this succession, which is fully optional, is to view the automatically parsed job inside the web interface. So what happens is that the job that we submit from command line is also automatically parsed, and it appears inside the web interface as well. So we propagate the results, we propagate the materials information to some level into the web interface. So if I navigate back to my account here, so click and close the terminal session, I will see that this calcium, tungsten, oxygen 4 job, the two of them, in fact, appeared inside my jobs list. And they are parsed to the best of these capabilities, the platform capabilities today. That includes things like Fermi energy, total energy contributions, and it attempts to extract the band structure, which we didn't really calculate in this case, but we do have the energy bands levels, so it does attempt to extract them. Okay, and all the files for this calculation are also present on line 2. Why it's important? It's important because we can also have the 7th step, which is optional again. We can share this job. And we can share this job between multiple accounts on the web interface. We can make it public online so that other people can see this job. To do that, we click on share. We select the actions bar for this job that has finished already, click on share. And what I do here is I share this calculation with my personal account. So I'm running this calculation originally from within the webinar account. Then I can select to share it with my personal account to have access to it when I'm using the platform as Timur Basharov, not as the webinar account. Okay. And now we can see that the job was indeed shared. Okay, so this is the progression that we have to go through to run a command line job. Now let's see how we can do exactly the same thing using the exabyte platform approach, the second option. So steps 1 and 2 are to create a material and workflow that we have already covered earlier. And step number 3 is to create a job using this material and workflow. We can do that by navigating to the jobs list and navigating to the projects list first. So if you like to start a calculation directly from the jobs list, it will prompt you to navigate into the project first. So we open the projects list and go to the default project and then click on the plus tab. Now this is the job designer interface. And here we can set the name of the job, SCF and SCF for calcium tungsten 04, and then select materials for it. So this is the list of materials that we have pre-created before. This is the calcium tungsten 04 from PWSCF. We select that, and here we go. It is populated inside the tab. The second step is to select the workflow. We do that. So at this point, the job contains the material and the workflow that we have created previously in the platform. The next step after that is to inspect the workflow and adjust the unit input file parameters. So here we navigate into the input for the workflow. First of all, we check the pseudo potentials. Everything is fine. It is pre-populated with the default pseudo potentials inside the platform. And we can navigate into the PWSCF input and check the preview of this file. So at this point, since we already selected the material, the preview of this scf.in file has to be very similar to the file that we have on the disk. Okay, so we check and we look at key points parameters. In the original file, we had 4x4x2. Right now, we have pre-populated values according to the KPP array. That is 5x5x5. KPP array is the key point per reciprocal atom that has a default value too. So what we need to do right now is to set the key points according to what we had before. And we can do that by using the important settings panel. So inside important settings panel, we can navigate to pw_scf unit and change the dimensions of the key grid, which is exactly what I'm doing here. So 4x4x2. And then I'm going to the PWNSCF file and changing the dimensions for the grid there too, to 8x8x8, 8x8x6. And I changed the name as well to indicate that I have edited the key grid parameters. Okay. So the next step after that is to set up the compute parameters. And that's a topic of a separate discussion. There could be quite a bit of complex details about it, but here we only do a couple things. First of all, we select the ordinary regular queue, which is good for most of the calculations. We still use one single node, and we use 18 cores, which is recommended on cluster 001 for relatively large calculations like we have. And then I select myself to be notified for all the events associated with this calculation. And then I click Save. Okay, so by the end of this step, we have the calculation created inside the platform and available as a job here in the list. The job has the pre-submission status shown in blue, and it has some information about it, like the application, the cluster and submission queue, a number of cores and such. So the next step after that is to submit the job. I'm selecting the menu here. Oh, I did that in the previous video. I submitted the job by selecting the run action from the actions dropdown. What happens after that is the job gets into the submission status. And we have to wait for a little bit here while the resources are provisioned. We are using the on-demand regular queue, which does have 2 to 5 minutes wait time for cluster 001. So we have to wait for the job to start running. So within 2 minutes, we can see that status is changing from submitted to active. And we can navigate into the job to see how it progresses. So we do that, we open the job. We navigate down to open its PWSCF unit. Orange color means that it's currently active. And inside the output tab, we can see the output of Quantum Espresso. The charts tab shows us the convergence chart for the electronic subsystem. And it's updated in real time. Okay. So when the calculation is done, the PW_SCF unit is turned green. And the second unit is turned orange, indicating that it's active now. This is a production type calculation, so it takes quite some time. There's 72 total key points that it goes through. So after about 15 minutes or so, both of the units are done, and both of them are turned green, as we can see here. The bolder outline corresponds to the presently active unit, the unit that you just clicked on. And step number 7 in this progression is to view the results. So when the calculation is finished, we can see the results tab. The results tab and files tab are also available while the calculation is running. So we navigate to see the results to the results tab, and we can scroll down and see the results for each of the units. So at the top, we see the PWSCF unit. At the bottom, we see the PWNSCF. Okay. And the files tab contains the files that this calculation produced. Again, these files are originally produced on the infrastructure, on the cluster that we have discussed in the very beginning. But they're also available on the web, so people never have to navigate into command line to access them. Okay. There is a way to navigate back to the compute node and see the cost of this calculation from the compute dialog. There are also certain logs available for us when the calculation was started, how long it ran for, and things like that. Okay, so we are a little bit over time here, so I'm going to summarize the CLI versus UI jobs here. Command line jobs are quick to start with and can be familiar to many, but they require users to modify and edit the input files each time when a job is created. They only store the data on disk, and they make it difficult to share and collaborate with this information that is produced. The jobs that originate on the user interface, they take time to get used to, but when implemented properly with a flexible workflow units and plates logic, as I demonstrated, they can deal with multiple materials at once, so we can create high throughput calculations for potentially hundreds or thousands of different materials through a single job designer session. And the data is automatically organized in the database, so we can come back and search through the properties, materials, and jobs. And it's very easy to collaborate and share these types of calculations, even publicly. So most people will use a limited number of workflows during their career span even. So when the required workflows are migrated, we can apply these workflows to many, many different materials. The number of materials is usually much higher than the number of different workflows that we use. And so little modifications really are required to the workflows. Okay, so I think I'm mostly done with the presentation today. So let's see if we have any questions at this point. There are no questions present in the chat right now. You still have some time to ask if you'd like to. Okay. If there are no questions, I'd like to thank all the participants. Thank you very much for following this. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at any time, either at info@exabyte.io or to me personally at Timur, T-I-M-U-R, @exabyte.io. Thank you very much, and we will be continuing on with the webinar series in 2 weeks with getting started topics.